welcome to Literary Gladiators, the show where we discuss, debate literature in all of its forms. If it's written work, it's game. Let's meet the panel.
Hi, I'm Larry.
Hi, I'm Rennie.
I'm Tori.
And I'm Josh. And Tori, welcome back to our panel.
Happy to finally be here.
It's been a few months.
Yeah, it has.
But we thought that in order to celebrate you coming back, and since Rennie was my instructor for Shakespeare back at OCC, we are going to be going over a Shakespeare play, one that you suggested, and it's Titus Andronicus.
Yeah, this was an interesting one. I gave, I think, 2 options, and this was the one that we ended up on. So I'm going to preface this now. This is not a favorite work of mine. It's not nowhere near a favorite work, and I'm also going to say there's some interesting topics that are going to be broached with this play.
It's not a favorite work of mine. It's my least favorite work.
Yeah, it's a least favorite, and I think it's not exactly a least. I think it's a least favorite for like a lot of people who know Shakespeare. I don't know. I'm not going to speak for everybody, but like of the Shakespearean plays out there, it's a funky one.
Yeah, critics have said that this was one of, if not the worst, Shakespeare play.
Yeah, I have some fun critic quotes that range from like the 1600s to like the 1940s. People were still like throwing shade in the 1940s about this play. 1940s,
even
1950s.
more recently, somebody said that Mel Brooks was the only one that could possibly direct this play.
However, in the 50s, Laurence Olivier did it, and later his former wife, Vivian Leigh, played a Lavinia, so it's been performed very frequently.
Oh, yeah.
And was one of his few plays after his death that continued to be performed popularly. Now, I don't know if that's because of the bloodiness.
He wrote the play based off of popular demand.
Oh god, yeah, the play is it's a carbon copy of revenge plays for the 16th century, which were highly popular, and that's one of the point of contentions that people have. This is a highly contested play, where it's like, did he write it? Didn't he write it? There are people who say he did. There are people who say he didn't. There are some people who say it was written before the 1580s. There are people who say it was written after the 1590s. Like, there's so much arguments, that's not English. There are so many arguments, based off of this that it's absolutely hysterical, and I think that's what I found so interesting.
Allegedly, he wrote it with somebody too.
Yeah,
It might have been George Peele.
Yeah, it was a
But
poet.
I'm going to doubt that because evidently it is nothing like anything else Peele actually ever wrote. And it
No.
has Shakespeare's structure.
It does. I mean, it's formative. It's when he was still beginning. It's his first tragedy, and I think it shows signs of like a neophytic playwright. It's not as like the characters are not as well thought out and rounded out as the other characters in
I
his
think
plays.
we can reword that his characters were terrible.
The character
Because not only were they one-dimensional, and Shakespeare found it so easy to kill them off. That's one thing I hated, was the fact there was no resistance. It was with Mutius. When Mutius was blocking the door from his dad, "My lord, you pass not here." And Titus says, "What villain boy? Barst me my way in Rome." And about ready to kill him, Mutius, "Help, Lucius, help!" Boom!
Yeah.
Kills him.
So just if you don't know Titus Andronicus, the play starts out with the leading character coming back from war with almost all of his sons, 25 sons or something?
23 dead.
23 of his 25 sons dead. So there's 14 killings in all. 9 are on stage, which is a considerable amount, especially for Shakespeare, like on-stage deaths.
And fairly unusual. Most of those big deaths are off stage and reported.
Yeah, usually, 16 people have severed limbs, 1 or more. There are, depending on how you look at it, 1, 2, 3 different rape scenes in the play. There's 1 live burial, 1 case of insanity or feigned insanity, 1 case of cannibalism, and that's just like a broad. Yeah, it's a fun
2 of
play. It's a real
them,
fun play.
Demetrius and Chiron, were both turned into pie.
Yeah, it's a fun read.
That was that was probably the most interesting way to dispose of a dead body.
And the best part is, none of those deaths and like the dismemberments and stuff like that, almost none of it is original. It's all stuff that's heavily pulled
Just
from
about-
other myths.
Just about nothing that Shakespeare put together was ever
Yeah.
original.
Right.
The reason
Yeah.
Shakespeare is so
Borrow.
renowned is because of the way that he wrote. It was his
Yes.
work, his use of words, not his stories.
Even, I'm going to go to another play than this. I say this play is Hamlet because it's a revenge play by way of The Walking Dead.
Well, Hamlet is the mentioned later on in my
But,
research. Yeah.
For instance, if you read Julius Caesar and you read Plutarch's Life of Caesar, Shakespeare needed a play in 2 weeks. They needed new production, and he just lifts it and dramatizes it. He just takes Plutarch's words and puts them in his characters' mouths. Now, but that's the difference between drama and history, because I once had a student ask where Et tu, Brute comes from. It doesn't come from Plutarch. That's Shakespeare. And you can see in Titus, in Aaron, you can see Iago
Oh,
coming.
absolutely, yeah.
In the madness of Titus, you can see Lear coming. You can see some of the revenge coming in Hamlet, but it's because there's also 8 or 9 deaths in Hamlet, but many of them are not on stage.
Yeah, and I think that's the big difference between all the other plays and this play is a lot of the brutality is on stage. And I read somewhere that there are some people who argue that this play was almost mocking the audience for that kind of stuff because revenge plays were so popular when it was written. He kind of said, okay, sure, you guys want violence? Here it is, and almost mocks the audience's love of violence and gore by putting so much of it on stage. So I thought that was an interesting point of contention.
You say that this is Hamlet meets The Walking Dead. Who would you say that Titus would be the Hamlet figure? Because
Well, he is the main figure, and he would be the tragic hero. Titus is considerably older than Hamlet. Hamlet is probably very young.
and Titus is just so unlikable too.
I have to say, I have never seen this on stage. I had not read this previously because I looked up my old Shakespeare book from college, and we did not read Titus Andronicus, although we read almost every page in the book.
I think
but
whoever
I
arranged
saw-
your curriculum made a good decision.
I
Absolutely.
saw Anthony Hopkins in a 1999 movie, and I have to say the way they did it was he plays it very much like Hannibal Lecter, very understated, very just say the lines without a tremendous amount of emoting in any way, and they film it very darkly. Almost everything is at night or in a dark room with candles, and it blunts some of the activity. Although, one of the things they do when Tamaris, the queen of the Goths' sons, are killed, he hangs them upside down on chains, naked. So that's really incredibly powerful, except their heads are away, so when he cuts the throats, you don't see him cut the throats. The heads are away from the audience, but that was certainly an incredible scene that they presented.
It would make the collection of the blood easier.
Yeah, because she comes and holds the blood under their heads, yes, and she can collect it much easier than if they're standing up. I've seen one where they were tied to trees. That would be a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
But that was an unusual presentation
It's-
that evidently was fairly popular.
It was fairly popular up until the Victorian era, where that kind of stuff was extremely frowned upon. So it was almost not touched at all up until more contemporary times, where it hit like the early 19th century, I guess, when it started up again. And some people argue it's because the
20th century?
20th century, sorry, thank you. I'm not fully here and I apologize. But the inherent violence that is shown on the stage in this play was not fully understood up until more recently, which is an argument that I saw, is that gore and that violence that we have today kind of almost in a lot of shows and movies and various other forms of media. There was not that much, again, visibly on stage with all the other plays. If somebody had some sort of terrible violent death, it was off stage, or it was alluded to off stage, either directly following the scene or somebody talks about it.
Well, in the movies, they cut off an arm in Lawrence of Arabia, which is set during World War I, and show that. That's 1960, and that was a big thing in its time. Today, we have the whole horror genre of splatter movies where they just love to spill blood on the lens so that there's blood running down the film. And so I would think Titus fits fairly well into that
It certainly
category.
does. Splatter punk is also a subgenre within horror. So it has shown its presence in written work, but I feel as if when it comes to splatter punk and blood and gore, as long as you are trying to, as long as it connects to a particular
It
purpose,
facilitates the story. If it's just
Yeah.
there for gore's sake, then it doesn't make any
like
sense.
in his play, yes.
Yeah. I went over this play in a Shakespearean tragedy class at OCC a couple years back, and the professor that went over it was like, now I want you to take this with a grain of salt. And she said she wanted to show a whole slew of different forms that Shakespeare's writing can take. And I think the question that I have here is, and I still don't know which one to go with, is was it written purposefully to be bad? Air quotes. Or what is it bad because it's a new writer approaching a popular genre?
You really don't know with Shakespeare. He wrote this, as I said before, it was because it was popular. It was popular demand. But I think I can add my criticism to it. It's immoral. I think that one of the most immoral parts was when Lucius takes Aaron and Tamora's mixed-race baby and threatens to kill it. I felt that it was ridiculous in how they spoke in third person. They were very disposable, the way that they killed them. It was just, boom, you're dead.
Death for death's sake.
Yeah, death for death. Basinius, it was interesting how Basinius and Lavinia, they structured them as going to become a couple, but they killed Basinius very quickly, and Lavinia was raped and had her hands and tongue chopped out.
Yeah.
And then,
so she can't identify the sons of Tamara for doing it.
Mhm.
The one thing with Shakespeare that I think sometimes gets lost because he wrote such great material sometimes is that he did not necessarily write terrific material all the time, considering he was really prolific. There's 37 attributable plays and more that some people want to add. And he wrote entire volumes of poetry, epics also.
The
So that
sonnets were good.
not everything is necessarily going to be absolutely terrific. But as I say, this play was evidently extremely popular. Henslow, that we get, who was a producer and a director, that we get a tremendous amount from on Shakespeare and everybody else at the time period because he wrote a lot, calls it in 1594 a new play and talks about all the people that have produced it. There's been 3 or 4 or 5 companies that have already done it and seems to be quite content with it, not saying anything in a derogatory manner, and he certainly could say something because he once said of Shakespeare's acting that he was extremely wooden.
Yeah, Shakespeare himself as an actor was not necessarily well received, if I remember correctly, and I think he's actually poked fun of himself in other pieces.
He seems
about that.
wooden as a person, too. I think it's through his writing that we see him flourish with his... but that's with many writers, I think, that...
Most of their personality goes into their work, be it an actor or a writer or any sort of performer, or anybody who does entertainment for a living. If you look at the person, they're very bland most of the time. So.
Yeah, I would say that. So.
And I'm going to say if some of the violence, that's the difference between reading it and seeing it, because on the flat page it just says, yes, and this person is stabbed, and yes, and that person's head is cut off, and yes, this person's hand is cut off, and then you just go on to the next line or the next scene, because you don't see any
There's no
action and there's no
time
pause.
to
That's the
enact,
issue
yeah.
I had, was the fact
Yes.
that at least a skirmish could break out of it.
Yeah, so
And
the-
there was no, that's the same, the last part was just, I think Lavinia's death was immoral. I think that it was supposed to be an honor killing, but they're celebrating,
It was a shock. I think it was written purposely to be like a shock to for it
There
to-
is a whole, there's a whole pile on there in the very last scene of all kinds of
Yeah.
terrible things.
yeah,
that
first
occur.
Titus he kills
that whole entire thing was
Lavinia.
just a
Well,
ridiculous
first
scene.
Then he
Titus
kills-
feeds
First he brings out the
mother.
pies.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Feeds the pie.
It starts in the scene
He
previous.
kills Lavinia, then he kills Tamora, then Saturnius kills him, and then
Lucius kills Saturnius, yes.
Yeah, and the
That
way
was-
Lucius
It's the funniest
disposes.
tennis court match
Yeah.
you'll ever see.
Yes.
Like just back and forth and back and forth. I was going to say something based off of that, and I totally lost it, and I apologize.
I think that also comes of, some of Poe is like that, like the Pit and the Pendulum.
Mm.
They have the agony, those, if you do the triangle for the rising action climax going in. The story goes on and on and on because it's a long story. All of a sudden, Spanish Inquisition ends. Bango. That's the resolution. And Shakespeare does kind of the same thing with Titus. You have all this buildup. It's not that you haven't had nasty things happening all along, but he has this revenge. You have to get rid of Tamora. You have to get rid of this person. You have to, I guess, you have to resolve Lavinia somehow. How is she going to survive in the world, in her life? And so, yes, it just packs it all in.
But
That's
just to
the
do it
end.
randomly.
That's
I
the
think,
end.
but I think at least with Edgar Allan Poe, you can pretty much make the you can draw the conclusion that his characters are mad, and that's what causes.
Well, Titus is mad, theoretically.
Yes.
The fact that you kill just about all of your children makes you mad right off the
Only
bat.
2 out of 25.
You're right. Yeah, well,
And the others were killed
he
in
technically
war.
did not kill the rest of
Right, the
them.
others were killed
Yeah,
in
the
war.
22 others or so that they were killed in battle.
Yes.
So
They're
he
done
gets
before
a
he gets
gimme
to
for that
Rome.
one.
Yes.
It's a mulligan on that one.
That's what you want to do.
And Lucius becomes emperor, so it's, it's a
Yes.
happy ending.
Exactly.
Yes, it is kind of, because his last son or grandson becomes the emperor.
So I saw an interesting argument for this as well, is that it's supposed to prove a point with so much violence. Aside from mocking the audience, it's also kind of like a way of saying that blood will get blood, and that's not a good way of looking at life, to enact violence on someone else because they either enacted violence on you or are going to enact violence on you. So that cyclic cycle of harm on someone else, harm on myself, like that kind of stuff is another point of the play. And that's a reoccurring theme, is that's why there's so much violence on stage, is to prove that point of doing violence on another individual, no matter what the cost on yourself, is going to pay a hefty price. And there will always be retaliation. So
Well, there certainly can be some truth to that, but it's written in an age when people went to hangings, when they drew and quartered people and pulled them apart with
Oh,
4
absolutely.
horses while they were alive.
Mhm.
They went to bear baitings. These were the big things. They didn't have MTV.
no.
And
Xbox
how they did
wasn't
some of
invented
these
yet.
things on stage is a question too, how some of them were actually staged. You can certainly do something like this much easier in the movies, but I could see your point there, because if I could teach Romeo and Juliet on the college level, which I've never done, I would teach it as not a love story, but that the passions of the hatred of their families and the 2 young people are what caused all the deaths there. And that's what the friar says. If you don't do things moderately, you run too fast and you fall down.
That's a topic I did my paper on in your class, the passion leading to violence.
Yes, and so this could be true here too, that in somehow mocking it, Shakespeare is saying, if you live this way or you carry on this way, it creates all this violence and
Yeah.
death.
I think that it was, I see it more as a work about revenge.
Well,
more
absolutely,
than-
that it's a revenge play.
Yes,
It
yes.
follows every single path, it has every single element needed for that. So,
Yeah, he sets that up immediately. He has a scene, something like in Shakespeare, where Metellus Cimber begs Shakespeare for the return of his exiled brother, and Caesar says the constant is the Northern Star speech, and he won't do it. But that's like in the third act. In the first act here, he brings in Tamora, the queen of the Goths, and executes her 2 sons right off the bat.
Yeah.
And she begs and begs for him to pardon them, and that starts the revenge instantaneously in the first act.
Yeah, you've got not one revenge story, but like
Yes.
2 or even 3 revenge stories kind of just intermingling in there. And where you have those scenes where kind of like I feel like Shakespeare has 2 different or 3 different stories going on, but they're kind of neatly, each act has its own part. The group kind of goes in and out. This is kind of all over the place and is very, very messy, both like strategically because of what's going on stage and also thematically, which I think is not, again, lends itself to that argument, and I can see where people argue, did Shakespeare write that? There's so many
I
weird
think
pieces
Shakespeare
of,
wishes he would not. I think.
I don't think so.
Sure,
I think you guys are being pretty hard on it. I think there's some profundity here that we're not even really talking about.
I'm interested to hear.
Okay, well, I think that the first thing that this play is dealing with, right, in the opening scene, was Saturn. What was his name? Saturninus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Saturninus.
So yeah, I think that
Bad guy.
he's the one that actually sets everything in motion. And the reason I say that is because he kind of defies what tradition dictates. Okay, like normally when you conquer an army, you bring them back as slaves, right? That's not what Suetonius does. He decides to free them and to marry
Tamora.
the wrong woman, right? Like tradition apparently would dictate, based on Titus's reaction, that he should marry Titus's daughter,
Yes.
based on the way things go. Instead, that guy, Saturn
dude. The
Saturn,
Saturn
the
dude.
Saturn guy,
The Saturn guy.
right?
Saturninus.
Makes the decision to marry
The enemy.
the enemy, and kind of sets the whole thing into motion from that point on.
Yeah, but it's the death of her sons that really starts the very first revenge, even though that might have been a bad move.
No, but yeah, it starts the revenge, but it's a tradition. Like I mean, that's just what they did, right? It was the fact that the roles kind of lost their traditional place that opened the door to allow Tamora and Aaron and the 2 boys to do everything that they did. Had that not happened, it would have just been another conquest.
Yeah, but if Shakespeare doesn't do that, it's like Hamlet. If Hamlet acts right away, that's the end of the play. You don't get 5 acts. And if we don't have this untraditional kind of keeping Tamara as a major character and influential throughout, we also don't have the revenge play.
Yeah, but
Well,
you-
that's true, but it's still significant, right? Like when you're
Oh,
looking at these
absolutely.
things.
There's no way to argue that. It is a significant piece of the whole entire plot. That is an absolute astute
Yeah, Saturninus
observation.
is obviously a terrible Caesar and
Yeah.
never should have the position.
Yeah, that's true too.
He's not exactly the best.
Like, how would things have turned out if you chose Bassius instead? It probably would have gone better.
I don't know, maybe he doesn't last long enough for us
Yeah.
to see,
No.
for us to
He
see
doesn't.
him
And
as a
Bassianus
character.
doesn't really do anything to
Right.
fight for his
He'll
life.
die.
Yeah.
No. I think that's the other thing is people just die and they don't really do much about it. Like it's like, oh, okay, you're dead. Like you said, they're very expendable, which kind of I think adds that the static.
Yes, one thing that is definitely missing is grief or any period of recognizing
Yeah.
that somebody has been lost.
Grief,
which
but fight
you
scenes
know
too.
you wouldn't have in any kind of real life.
And I think that's why I say it likens to a bloody tennis match because it's literally like, oh, I killed you. Oh, okay, I'm chopping off your arm. Oh, okay, I'm going to kill your son.
At
It's
least-
just back and forth and back and
At
forth.
least in
There's
tennis,
no-
people are trying with their rackets to get the ball away to the other end of the
Well,
court.
they are. They're trying to get the hand away, and then the other hand away, and
But-
then the tongue away.
But if somebody came up to you with a knife and tried to chop off your hand, what are you going to do? Are you going to oh, here you go. Would you like any condiment, ketchup, dressing, mustard on here, or would you do that? Would you pull it away?
Yeah, another thing to say about that is he volunteers to send his hand at one point, so there's
Yes,
no
he
that
gives
that
his
argument
hand.
is given up, and there's some points there where
He volunteered,
people
but
are
that's because
ambushed. And,
the reason he does that is because it's the whole idea that it's sinful.
yeah,
The limb, in this case, the hand, is sinful. The idea that if someone used to steal with a particular hand, they would chop it off.
the other thing I caution is we're looking at this with a whole heck of a lot of time and other forms and other
Yes.
eras and waves. I can't find my words today, and I do apologize, but we're looking at it through the lens of somebody who has had years to be able to dissect the piece and hold it up to other pieces that are very similar to it. Looking at it then, I think, is the most confounding part, is why was this written, and why, more importantly, did it survive time? And I love somebody said that, like, the only reason why it survived this long is because Shakespeare's name was on it. If it was Joe Schmo who wrote it, this play would not have survived.
I don't think
It would have been treated as a
No, I
joke.
don't like that.
Because it's so, like, dime a dozen revenge play.
But
Like,
it's not.
there's nothing exceptional about it.
But I don't know that that's true either, because it is one of his few plays that after he died continued to be regularly presented when most of his works fell into disuse until
Mhm.
Dryden revised him under Charles
That's
II.
It was Christopher Marlowe was the feature playwright during the Shakespeare era.
Mhm.
And to me-
And so it even went on into the 1640s and the 1650s, and it's done up in the 1700s in the Augustan age of literature, when we were all so classical. So it has some charm that audience have liked.
I think that when something like that happens, that kind of phenomenon suggests to me that people didn't really understand it yet. Like, I think that people act things out, right? Like through drama, specifically, without really knowing what it means, right? Like, I mean, the idea that you know what something means at the time that you write, especially the ancients, is not really, I don't think, the way that it worked. Like in the ancient days when the Greeks were coming up with their tragedies and things, they're trying to show themselves, you know, an image of themselves, and then they watch it. They're fascinated by it because they're trying to see something important.
Yeah, catharsis, yeah.
And it's not just catharsis. It's trying to learn. It's trying to learn about who we are, right? Like, it's the whole idea of like Jungian archetypes and stuff like that, where you take these patterns of behavior, and then you give them different scenarios and see what happens, see how they interplay. And I think that the fact that this play lived on for so long and was so popular for so long is an indication that it has something important to say. And it's either about the tradition and chaos dichotomy, which is very to me plain, right? Like, I mean, that seems to me. I mean, even with Aaron in the woods, right? When he says to Mora that you're being governed by Venus, I'm being governed by Saturn, right? Saturn, you know, in those times, and even today, is kind of like a god of chaos, right? Like, free Rome, the Golden Age, as it was called, you had Saturn, and the festival for him would be role reversal, so that masters would serve their slaves for the day, and things like that. So it's kind of like that shifting, that breaking down of things.
The fact that Saturn is the god of chaos makes it even more interesting why Saturnius is the central, he's one of the nominees for emperor, and I think he's pretty much the nominee once Licinius is killed.
Well, isn't he named right off the bat in the first act, or is that just
I
like an
want to say,
endorsement?
yeah, I feel it is.
Yeah.
But
I'm
And
not
then it's
sure
also-
that people just don't like, in some ways, the sheer bloodiness of it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's what they evidently like, because as you see it, regardless of maybe anything symbolic or thematic, it starts in the 1500s. It might have started as early as in the 1580s, but it's definitely in Shakespeare's name in 1594. And you see this running decade by decade into the later 1600s, into the 1700s, into the 1800s, and all of a sudden today there is incredible interest in it again. I think some of that is that maybe Macbeth is, overdone, or they've seen too many Hamlets already and they're looking for something else that's
there
different.
are plenty of them that
But,
have much more
but,
recognition.
this is something. Actually, in the 90s, the big thing they were looking at was Coriolanus, which is kind of a sister or brother because it's set in Rome about the
Yeah,
same
it's
time.
very similar.
And
I
there's
think
much
Coriolanus is,
similar to it.
I went over that for senior seminar, and
There's another.
I think that it was much more thought out. I think that,
Well, I'm just saying that was a play that was all of a sudden resurrected, and everybody was doing it in the 90s.
and that's Shakespeare's last tragedy,
Yes.
so.
Well, I mean, and we're living in a time now where tradition is kind of being forsaken,
And that's a good thing.
Evolving,
which
yeah.
is no, I mean, it's pretty much being forsaken. Like religion is being cast aside in numbers like we've never seen.
Well,
Immigration
Here,
is,
but if you go across the Delaware, it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And
where?
it's the East Coast and the West Coast.
Oh.
And in some of Europe, the big cathedrals and so forth are
It
empty.
shifts.
But
You know,
there's
that kind of
shifts.
stuff shifts.
But if you take that away and you look at the rise of Islam, it is still spreading and going like mad all over the world. So. But
Right.
I have to say, we do live through these cultural differences. I mean, we are now into the electronics. Everything is online. Everything is in your pocket. Everything is in front of your face. There is a definite difference there. And I also think that in some cases makes some of this goriness, we stand back from it. We don't really feel for Lavinia. We don't really feel for Titus. We don't really feel, you say the characters are too wooden and cardboardy, but I think we like that in a way.
I think in a way I felt for Lavinia and Aaron and Tamora's baby. And in a way, young Lucius, because he was really young going into this situation. So, in essence, the women and children.
You can sympathize for them, but there's
The women and children, the inferior women and children, not Tamora, because
she absolutely
is-
knows what kind of she
Yeah.
she says outright what kind of person she's going to be.
Yeah.
It's very evident what kind of person she is throughout the entire play. And like you said, with the right off the bat, the killing of her two sons, it's absolutely justified. You know, and you can almost kind of feel a little bit bad for her, but she kind of just makes it very, very easy.
and the killing of Demetrius and Charon being turned into the meat pie, too.
Yeah, that doesn't help.
Well, that's right out of Greek
That's-
tragedy.
that's-
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's
I
the
think
house
there's
of
a-
Atreus.
Yeah.
Yes.
They raped Lavinia, so they got what
Want.
they were served.
And that, we
And
did
in
the
turn they were
wasteland.
served.
We did the wasteland earlier. That is the Procne and Philomela right out of Ovid's Metamorphosis, where when she's raped, she turns into a nightingale, but Lavinia couldn't turn into a nightingale. But they are both in the wasteland, and I thought that's why you put them together, actually.
Oh, that's funny.
I just did that out of coincidence.
Yeah.
Wasteland, Wasteland was something I wanted
Really
to
a
go
terrific
over.
coincidence.
A little synchronous.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Ready then. Do we have any final thoughts?
Yeah, it's not as bad as they say. I say read it. It's good.
Oh, I don't say it's bad. Oh, please don't. I don't think it's a bad play at all. It's Shakespeare, so I'm going to tell you to read it no matter what, because I think almost anything that he wrote is, at the very least, good. I think it's entertaining. It's an entertaining play, so I'll say that much. I'm not downplaying it. It's not my favorite. It's definitely not my favorite, but it's not terrible. I'm just talking for myself here.
I don't know that I think it's the worst play he
Yeah.
ever wrote or the worst tragedy he ever wrote, but I will say to see it done, and I would recommend Hopkins' 1999 movie, does even out some of the more outrage, and it's played very directly, just as if you were playing Hamlet or Macbeth or whatever. It's presented very straightforward. They don't try to make anything really bloody, even though I mentioned a scene that is very disturbing, but still,
But pragmatic.
but pragmatic and works and within the structure of the play. There's another piece in the movie that is not from the play. They have Lucius go, I'm not sure whether it's like to a puppeteer or a statuary where they have arms and legs and pieces, and he brings Lavinia hands and they show them being put on. Otherwise they have her hands like under a veil so you can't see. And so then she has these fake hands that she gestures with. I have to say that's a little peculiar. But you can do that in a film.
One could say the imagery
Yes.
is heavy-handed.
Yes,
yeah.
the imagery is very, very strange, but I enjoy watching it. I don't know that I'm that thrilled with reading the actual text itself.
It's interesting that you say that that Hawkins' performance is understated,
Yes, very dry.
because, I mean, to me, the character seems so over the top.
Yes.
The way he's written.
That's why, yeah, he pulls that all back. I'm not sure that Shakespeare probably doesn't want it played over the top. He wants all of that, I think, out there. But
I would have loved the Julian Taymor version.
Yes.
Because I only saw 20 minutes of that and I could only get through 20 minutes. I do not suggest watching that unless you have a night that you can process it afterwards, because it was over the top, I can tell you that much. So
I'm sure it was meant to be over the top.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was presented
Oh,
over the
absolutely.
top.
Yeah, they don't call it drama for nothing.
Yes.
it is a piece that you
Or
need to
tragedy.
sit down and read and take your time with. I'll say that much. So it's interesting, it's gory, and it does its job very, very well of being a revenge play set in Greco-Roman era. So
Already then. How would we rate it on a scale of 0 to 5 stars with half stars permitted, as Goodreads puts together?
I'll give it 3.5 stars.
I go 4.
I'm gonna stick to the 3.5 with you because it's not terrible, but it's not
The best.
the best.
How many fingers am I holding up?
This is where you're going to go 0.
Well, I don't think any of Shakespeare is a 0.
I would give this 0 stars. I gave it 0 stars because
Explain.
it's immoral. It's very. The characters are wooden and disposable. It's almost as if you can get the same kind of entertainment in either a video game or
He's one of those folks. You're
or-
one of those folks.
or Teletubbies or Boobas.
Teletubbies. What
I-
version of Teletubbies are you watching, dude?
I think it'd be more interesting to see Tinky Winky hit things with a pocketbook than the very random deaths that take
Breathe,
place
Tori.
within here.
This is just a weird mental image. Let's get away from
Talk
that.
about-
Tinky Winky and Titus Andronicus are not subject to match.
Yeah, both of them drive you insane. Alrighty then, if you're interested in checking out this play, which Larry thinks you should be,
It's
I
got
do.
value.
I agree with you. It has value. I agree with you
Okay.
wholeheartedly. Yeah, I'm not. Again, I don't think it's a bad play.
it does if you are a kid that is interested in violent video games.
There's a lot more to it than that.
Oh,
Yes,
It's not a
yes.
video game.
Yeah.
You can find it in this complete collection of Shakespeare's plays, the ones that are attributed to him, starting with King Henry VI, which is the first part of King Henry VI, and goes all the way to King Henry VIII. This asserts that Two Noble Kinsmen was a Fletcher play and not a Shakespeare. Be sure to join us next time for another episode of Literary Gladiators. For now, keep reading.
Thank you.